Well, welcome back to the final day of the West Cork History Festival. The sun is shining on the righteous. The bishop is here and keeping an eye on everyone, and I've assured him that you'll all be in church later. So just so you know our instructions. Anyway, it's a huge pleasure to welcome another first-time visitor to the History Festival, Professor Brian Walker. Many of you will know Professor Walker is the Emeritus Professor at Queen's University Belfast of Irish Studies. He is somebody who has written and commented on Irish politics and society, north and south, for many years. He's a graduate of Trinity College Dublin, and he is going to talk to us today in the first of a couple of contributions on the experience of the minority community in the South. And his topic is Southern Protestant Voices During the War of Independence and Civil War. So I invite you to welcome Professor Walker.
Simon, thank you very much. Now, can I be heard? Good. I'm delighted to be here this morning. I've often read about this history festival, so I'm very pleased to be speaking to you all here today. I want to begin by talking about a few personal connections I have with this part of the world. Recently, I discovered, to my great surprise, that my uncle, Billy Wilkin, a County Tyrone Presbyterian, who married my father's sister, Lila, in 1918, served with the Royal Munster Fusiliers in the Great War. I always knew he'd been in the army, but I assumed he'd served with an Ulster regiment. A few years ago, however, his son told me that, in fact, his father had served with the Royal Munster Fusiliers, but could give no explanation. Now, this is quite unusual. I've often looked at memorials in churches in Belfast. Very, very rarely, when they record the regiments, very rarely do I see a northern soldier serving with the Royal Munster Fusiliers. So I was very interested. Why was this the case? My cousin could tell me nothing. So I sent to London for my uncle's war record. I now know all about my uncle. I know the colour of his eyes, I know what height he was, and I know why he served with the Royal Munster Fusiliers. In 1914, he signed up with the North Irish Horse, which was a County Antrim cavalry regiment. His medical record revealed that he had a minor leg injury from his pre-war time as a footballer. He played for Cliftonville. He also played for Ireland. He was in the Irish team 1913 to 14, and in fact, he gave me one of his international caps. The medical record also revealed that he had this minor leg injury. I then found that in 1915, he was thrown from his horse and injured again. The troop was still at this stage in County Antrim. He was then sent to an officer training college in Oxford, after which he received a commission with the Royal Munster Fusiliers. My uncle, I discovered, was a Category C soldier. Now, what is a Category C soldier? Well, a Category A soldier is someone who's fit and go to the front line. Category B is someone who's got a wound but can be sent to hospital, repaired, sent back again. Category D, the lowest category, is someone who's badly wounded and has to be let go. He cannot return to the front. But Category C is someone who have a disability, an injury. You'd never dream of sending him to the front line, but he could man a barracks, he could guard an ammunition dump, he could train soldiers. And that's exactly what my uncle did. He never saw any fighting. He never left England or Ireland. He served in barracks with the Royal Munster Fusiliers, but he never actually saw any fighting. Now, he was demobilised in 1918. When I told my cousin that, he was very surprised. His father gave no indication of this. His father never talked about the war, and he assumed from that he had been, seen terrible things. That wasn't the case. But anyway, he chose not to reveal to his son exactly what he did during the war. The second connection I have with this part of the world concerns the Southern Irish Unionist leader from County Cork, the Earl of Middleton. No relation, I might add. About a year ago, I wrote a letter to the Irish Times about him. An article in the Irishman's diary concerned his sister, Albinia, who was an early Sinn Féin supporter who took an Irish name. The article referred to him as Anglo-Irish. I challenged this description in my letter. saying that before 1921, this term was rarely used, and the term Irish was more appropriate. Now, later on, if you want, I can give you some quotes to make that point. But anyway, after my letter appeared, I decided to do a little bit of reading on the Earl of Middle. I actually knew nothing about him. I was making a general point. I turned to his 1936 autobiography, and there, to my horror, I discovered he describes himself not as Irish, not as Anglo-Irish, but as English. I mean, of all the people I had to choose to make this point, this seemed to be the single worst. Now, I got very nervous at this point, and I was worried in case people like Charles Lysack would pick this up and write letters to the Irish Times, exposing me as a complete fraud. Anyway, that didn't happen. So I decided to look more into this gentleman, and I have to say to you, I do think he was Irish. Now, let me give you my evidence for this. His people were called Broderick, and in the 17th century acquired substantial lands in County Middleton. They are County Cork landlords now in the 18th and 19th century. However, he was born in England, went to Eton, and was MP for several English constituencies, 1880 to 1906. In 1906, however, he lost his seat. He entered the House of Lords on the death of his father, and he was leader of the Irish Unionists in the House of Lords. He also became leader of the Irish Unionist Alliance, which represented Southern Unionists. At the 1917 Irish Convention, he led the Southern Irish delegation, which nearly did a deal. They were able to link with the old Constitutional Nationalist Party and came up with a compromise for the Irish question. But this was scuppered by Ulster Unionists and the Catholic bishops. Anyway, in July 1921, following the truce, he was one of the Irish Unionists selected by Eamon de Valera to consult with him in the Dublin Mansion House. In the course of the truce, de Valera holds these meetings in the Mansion House to meet people and come up with views. And he wants to meet representatives of the Irish Unionist communities. Now, a year later, in the House of Lords, this is what Middleton says. He says, de Valera invited a certain Irishman whom he considered representative for his purpose to meet him in Dublin. I happen to be one of them. So there he is, I think, calling himself an Irishman. Now, there is an argument, what makes an Irishman or an Irishwoman? Do you have to be born in Ireland? Some people say you do. A lot of people say you do. But I can think of one person in 1921 who did not say that. And that was Mr. Eamon de Valera. So when the Earl of Middleton walked through the door, he didn't say, but you weren't born in Ireland. He wouldn't have said that because the Earl of Middleton said, well, you weren't born in Ireland either. Well, the question is then, why 15 years later does he call himself English? And I have to say, I then turned to the final chapter in his autobiography. And here he reveals that in 1920, his soldier son, Grenville Peck, was killed by the IRA. And in 1921, the home of his cousin, the Earl of Bandon, was burnt to the ground, and the Earl was then kidnapped and held a prisoner for some time. So I think because of these experiences, at the end of the day, he decided he really wasn't Irish. That's how I view these statements. Anyway, we can talk about that later. This morning I want to talk more generally about what happened to Southern Protestants in the period of the Irish War of Independence and Civil War, 1919 to 23. Now, in the past, most histories of these years have said little about their plight. As well, few histories of the Church of Ireland dwell on what happened. Recently, however, the subject has received much more coverage, and some of it a cause of controversy. In the short time I have today, I intend to look at some contemporary accounts about how they experienced these tumultuous years. My source is an unusual one which has never been used before, namely speeches made by bishops at General and Local Diocesan Church of Ireland Synods 1919 to 23. A few years ago I had access to the excellent Irish Times archive which enabled me to find these. And in my new book, which I can show you here, I actually have a full chapter on this subject. Members of the Church of Ireland comprise the largest section of the Protestant population in the 26 counties which became the Irish Free State. In 1911, members of the Church numbered just under 250,000. slightly over 3/4 of the southern Protestant population, and nearly 8% of the total population. By the next census in 1926, however, their numbers had fallen to 165,000, a fall over 1/3. Members were widely distributed and found in every county. In Dublin, Cork, and the three Ulster counties, Cavan, Monaghan, Donegal, there were sizable Church of Ireland congregations. But in other areas, especially in the west and south, parishes had few numbers. Members had a prominent role among the business and commercial world and included many of the gentry, although by this time Land Acts had placed most of their land in former tenants' hands. At the same time, other members, and they would have been a majority, were farmers, labourers and shopkeepers. To gain an insight into the experience of Southern Protestants during this tumultuous period, 1919 to 23, I've used this source, speeches made at annual and general synods of the Church of Ireland. Now, throughout this period, a general synod of the Church was held every May in Dublin, to be followed by local diocesan synods in various locations covering the whole country. This went on in spite of what was happening. These meetings happened every year. In the 26 counties, there were 29 dioceses, but organised in a variety of unions under 10 bishops and 2 archbishops. Consisting of elected lay and clerical members, the synods were concerned primarily with general church matters, but during this time contemporary political issues intruded. To assist in identifying the geographical location of the diocese, the places where the synods took place will be recorded. So when I say the Diocese of Austria, I have to tell you where it is, otherwise you won't know where I'm talking about. These events usually began with a speech by the bishop, who acted as president, and it is their speeches that were reported in the press. So I thought this was a good way of recording how they saw things over this period. Now, I cover all dioceses in my book, but here today I will pay special attention to the dioceses of Cork, Cloyne and Ross. As both leaders and observers of their dioceses, the bishops reflected many of the concerns and anxieties of their community. Sometimes in their speeches, they were outspoken in their comments, while at other times they were restrained, perhaps reflecting the dangerous times they lived in or concerned not to cause panic. The bishops were a very varied group. Before 1921, all were unionists in their politics. They saw themselves as Irish unionists. But occasionally some took a contrary position, as in 1918, when 3 bishops broke ranks with their fellow bishops to sign a declaration against partition, along with 17 Catholic bishops. Bishops Plunkett of Meath and Sterling Berry of Killaloe and Clonfert were members of the committee of the Irish White Cross Association, set up to distribute funds from America, which led to criticism from Lord Ashdown that committee members included Michael Collins and other notorious Republicans, as he called them. C.R. Dowes, Bishop of Cork, Cloyne and Ross, was one of 4 patrons of the Thomas McCurtain Memorial Fund and one of 2 clerical patrons, along with the Catholic Bishop of the Cork Distress Committee, set up to deal with distress and unemployment following the burning of the city. At the general election of 1918, the Sinn Féin party, with its demand for Irish independence, won 74 seats. Subsequently, relations broke down between Sinn Féin and the British government, and a guerrilla force of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, emerged to fight Crown forces. In July 1919, at the Killaloe Synod at Neenah in County Tipperary, Bishop Thomas Sterling Berry accused the government of a policy of vacillation and irritation, and then condemned strongly the murder of policemen of the Royal Irish Constabulary. At the Synod of the Joint Diocese of Cork, Cloyne and Ross on the 22nd of October 1919 in Cork, Bishop Dowes stated, "Murder, robbery and crime stain our native land and call forth our sternest and most uncompromising condemnation." End of quote. He expressed strong sympathy and admiration for the police, quote, "who are serving their country with such splendid loyalty and who in the discharge of their duties and in their efforts to maintain law and order are brutally attacked and often foully murdered. We owe them a deep sense of gratitude far beyond what anything words can convey, end of quote. In the years 1919 to 21, a total of 90 members of the RIC lost their lives in County Cork and City. Bishop Dowes wasn't the only one to condemn these actions. The Catholic bishop also did so. He went one step further. He excommunicated the IRA. At the General Synod in Dublin in May 1920, Archbishop C.F. Darcy described how, quote, the issues were so confused, the outlook so obscure. And then he went on to say, and how they'd been horrified by the deeds of bloodshed which had in the past few months stained the records of their country. At the Synod for the Cork Diocese in October 1920, Bishop Dowes noted briefly that the past year had been marked by some unpleasant events, as he called them, both within their united diocese and also outside its bounds, but stated that, quote, amid the various disturbances and disorders which had taken place among them, the ordinary ministrations of their church had been uninterrupted, end of quote. A year later, at the 1921 General Synod, Archbishop Darcy spoke again about the violent state of the country. He declared, members of our church and others in several parts of the country, quiet, defenceless farmers for the most part, have been most cruelly killed. We do not know for what reasons, and can but conjecture that it was because of their political views were not acceptable, end of quote. At the Cork Synod in October 1921, Bishop Dowes spoke briefly and cautiously about how, quote, the year had been one of fearful happenings and tragic events, end of quote. At the 1910 December general election, the 2 Cork seats and 6 out of 7 county seats had been won by the All for Ireland League, led by William O'Brien, and as policies of reconciliation between former landlords and tenants and between North and South. So Cork at that time was an amazing centre of reconciliation and moderation. In contrast, however, during the War of Independence, according to American historian Jim Donnelly, an estimated 50 big houses or suburban villas in Cork County, mostly owned by members of the Church of Ireland, were destroyed by the IRA. Why did this happen? In some cases, their owners were seen as loyalists, representing the Crown as magistrates or Lord Lieutenants, Deputy Lieutenants, and in others as reprisals for actions of the British Army. Later, an IRA commander in West Cork, Tom Barry, described targeting the homes of loyalists in reprisal for the activities of British soldiers. He said, our only fear was that as time went on, there would be no more loyalist homes to destroy, end of quote. At the Cork Synod, after his brief comments, he referred to the deaths of Major George O'Connor, Tom Bradfield and Mary Lindsay. He declared, we must hope on. Then he stated, we thankfully recognise that throughout our diocese, so many churchmen and Roman Catholics live side by side in terms of friendship and goodwill. Let me say something more about Mary Lindsay. Mary Lindsay was from Coachford, County Cork, and in 1921, she came across an ambush being prepared by the IRA for a British Army patrol. She informed the British authorities this was happening. She also sent word to the IRA that she'd done this to warn them, but they paid no attention. So the ambush went ahead, and the IRA were defeated and members were captured and put in jail. What then happened was that she then was seized by the IRA and her house burnt to the ground and she was kept a prisoner. Now, on the 7th of July 1921, this is after the truce, this letter appears in the Irish Times and it's entitled Mrs. Lindsay's Case. It's written by Mrs. Lindsay's sister, and she'd read that Lord Bandon, you remember I told you earlier Lord Bandon had been captured, well, he'd been released, but no mention has been made of my sister. On the 17th of February last, about 1 a.m, she was forcibly removed from her residence. Her chauffeur at the time, James Clark, was also removed. Subsequently, the house with its contents were destroyed by the IRA. The members of her family have been unable to obtain any information about her. Mrs. Lindsay is 60 years of age and physically unfit to undergo, without bad results, the hardships which she must have been called upon to endure. The IRA claimed to be at war, and as such, demand to be treated according to the rules of civilized warfare, one of which is that prisoners are allowed to communicate with relatives. The members of the IRA who are interned in camps can write regularly to their relatives, but this is denied to Mrs. Lindsay and James Clark, whose relatives are thus kept in cruel surprise. They are now prisoners for just 19 weeks, and my sister is the only case of a woman being so treated. Surely she ought now to be released, or at least definite information ought to be given as to whether she and James Clark are alive or dead. Well, information did then come from official IRA quarters to say that they were both dead. I understand to this day their graves have never been discovered. In July 1921, a truce was agreed between the IRA and the British government. This was followed by discussions between the government and Sinn Féin representatives. The outcome was the Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921, whereby the 26 counties achieved a large degree of self-government to be known as the Irish Free State, but not a republic. In a sermon in Dublin on the 11th of December 1921, Archbishop Gregg declared, the Church of Ireland Archbishop of Dublin declared, "We may not like the facts. Many of us had no desire for a change in our constitution, but it concerns us all to offer to the Free State, the Irish Free State, as shortly to be constituted, our loyalty and goodwill." End of quote. In early 1922, however, the RIC was disbanded and the British Army was withdrawn, with the result that much of the countryside was subject to considerable lawlessness. In the north, the situation deteriorated with attacks by the IRA and tough government countermeasures, as well as sectarian attacks, particularly affecting Catholic families. At the end of April 1922, Republicans were responsible for the killing over 2 days and nights in the Dunmanway district of County Cork, for the killing of 10 Protestants, of whom all but one were members of the Church of Ireland. These murders were regarded as sectarian reprisals or revenge for sectarian attacks in the north. During the first months of 1922, the press reported many other examples of intimidation of Protestant families, farmers and businesses for various political, economic and sectarian reasons. In early May, Archbishop Gregg, the Primate of all Ireland, noted in his diary, "A week of very great anxiety," sorry, he's the Archbishop of Dublin, "a week of very great anxiety as to the Church's future. News of evictions, ejections and intimidation everywhere. Where will it all lead? Is it the beginning of the end or short term? Provisional government so far powerless to intervene." End of quote. On the 11th of May 1922, an official Church of Ireland deputation met Michael Collins, head of the new Irish government, to express their deep concerns. Collins responded by saying that, I quote, "The government will protect its citizens and will ensure civil and religious freedom in Ireland." End of quote. However, whatever about these reassurances, the government now faced major political issues over the treaty, which led to civil war in June 1922. The next 6 months saw more death, destruction and lawlessness than the previous 3 years. During this time, members of the Protestant community endured widespread violence for a mixture of political, economic and sectarian reasons. People were intimidated because they were seen as ex-unionists or loyalists. Land agitation affected many Protestant farmers and landowners. In some places, sectarian factors came into place. Some synods, as in the west of Ireland, were unable to meet in these troubled times. At other synods, there were reports of this ongoing violence. In Armagh, in October 1922, Archbishop C.F. Darcy, referring to the South, said, "Anarchy and outrage have left terrible scars. Many of the very best of our people have been driven from our shores. The sufferings which have been endured can never be told." At Cashel, in early November, Bishop Robert Miller spoke. He declared that besides interference with property, dreadful and unspeakable crimes had been committed. On the 25th of October 1922, Bishop Dowes spoke briefly to the United Cork Synod. he asked, "Who can adequately describe the times through which our people have passed during the last few months? The memories of those ghastly massacres in West Cork can never pass away." He then went on to acknowledge the message of support his community had received from organisations such as Cork Corporation and Cork Roman Catholic Young Men's Association. In December 1922, the government, in a significant gesture to the Protestant minority, saw to or were responsible for the election of 20 Protestants or appointment of 20 Protestants to the new Senate. This is a very significant gesture to the Protestant community. The government did this. Unfortunately, this gesture proved to be a double-edged sword. Whereas some people's homes had been destroyed because they were seen as loyalists, now they're seen as supporters of the Free State government. Many of their homes were torched by Republicans because now their owners were viewed as supporters of the Free State government. And other such country homes were destroyed, making a total of 50 between January and November 1922, and another 89 between November 1922 and early spring 1923. Intimidation of church members extended beyond owners of country houses. An editorial in the Irish Times, 3rd of October 1922, described, quote, "losses which have fallen with peculiar severity upon the ex-unionists of the South and West, upon farmers and shopkeepers, as well as upon the owners of great estates and lordly mansions," and stated that, quote, the exodus from Southern Ireland will continue as long as the campaign of destruction flourishes," end of quote. The editorial rejected the idea that there was any well-organised system in this campaign of destruction and violence, but also claimed that the southern minority were the foremost sufferers in the current disorders, and they urged the government to do more. Comments by Catholic bishops at this time confirmed the harsh treatment of Protestants. They also show their strong condemnation of these events. In February 1922, the Catholic Bishop of Cork, Dr. Colan, described how, quote, "Protestants have suffered severely during the period of the Civil War in the South," end of quote. And he urged that charity knows no exclusion of creed. Speaking at Nina in North Tipperary in 1922, the Catholic Bishop of Killaloe, Michael Fogarty, appealed to a higher sense of patriotism, noting that, quote, "their Protestant fellow countrymen, he regretted to have to say it, were persecuted and dealt with in a cruel and coarse manner." In the last week of May 1923, a ceasefire was declared to end the Civil War. On the 16th of May, the General Synod of the Church of Ireland met in Dublin. The previous evening, Bishop Peacock of Derry and Raphoe, in a sermon in St. Patrick's Cathedral, spoke of the ordeal that people had endured for several years. He said, and I quote, "For whatever reason, some because of their religion, often for political or social causes, the members of their church had been much the worst sufferers in this time of disturbance," end of quote. The next day, the primate, Archbishop Darcy, spoke very briefly and cautiously about a very anxious and terrible year of suspense and trouble. He said, "Tens of thousands of all classes and creeds had fled from the land. Many of the best were gone. Their church," he declared, "had suffered especially, although all churches had been impoverished." End of quote. He was now hopeful that peace and order would be restored. At the Elfin Synod at Boyle, County Roscommon, in July 1923, Bishop Moore spoke of the very difficult condition of times since they last met. And he said, "One of the saddest features of the situation is that so many members of our communion have been driven from the country." At the Killaloe Diocesan Synod at Nina, also in July 1920, Bishop Sterling Brary spoke of the losses they'd suffered. And he gave this advice. He warned, "One of the worst results of civil strife is the risk that it may leave antagonisms which will endure for generations." He praised the ideal of a generous forgiveness and a forgetfulness of the past. The United Cork Diocesan Synod occurred in Cork on the 13th of June 1923. In his address, Bishop Dowes referred to the decrease of the Church of Ireland population in Cork. During the last 2.5 years, he said, our church population has decreased by 8%. It is serious, but does not call for despair. Many of our people have gone. Neither we nor their country could afford to lose them. Their houses have been burned. Destruction has marched through the land. The ruins of Ireland may well make all who really love her weep. End of quote. In fact, the 1926 census showed a considerably higher figure of Church of Ireland decrease. This for the years 1911 to 26, a decrease of 40% for Cork County and 53% for Cork City. Now what we have to do is remove the military from that, because they give an artificial picture of the number of people from the Protestant community in 1911. They're all gone by 1926, but that's for like a perfectly normal reason. And if we exclude the military, the police and their dependents, we come up then with a decline of about 7,000, or around 30% for the whole period, 1911 to 26 for Cork City and County. The underestimate by Dowes may be due to an effort not to be pessimistic, lack of knowledge of the full picture, or partly the result of decline 1923 to 26. He continued, Dowes continued after having made that point, but notwithstanding all our losses, we are not going to be chilled into inactivity or give way to depression. That way lies disaster. He referred to the clergy and their wives. In loneliness and danger, in trial and distress, they have remained steadfast and have stood by their people, helping them and being helped by them. End of quote. He acknowledged that during these trying years, they have acted as good citizens. He said, they have lived in friendliness and good fellowship with their Roman Catholic neighbours, and Roman Catholic and churchmen have proved mutually helpful to each other all over the diocese. End of quote. Now, the last synods for 1923 were held in the West, Tuam, Killala. These had not occurred in 1922 because things were so tough. But I want to just read to you a couple of things that the bishop there said. In Killala, he talked about many of our people. This is October 1923. Many of our people have left our shores to seek new homes elsewhere. We hope they will be happy there, but we ask them not to forget those who remain. And then in Tuam, in October, he said this: we of the Church of Ireland love our country. We would not be true members of the Church of Ireland if we did not. Our very name, of which we are justly proud, betokens our lineage. We are the Church of the whole, and not a part of Ireland. And no power on earth will ever, please God, partition our church, whatever it may do with our country. Some concluding remarks are appropriate. Through these contemporary speeches, we have heard of the plight of... Let me just make sure I've got this here. Yes. We have heard of the plight of Southern Protestants in these troubled times. The publication of the 1926 census showed that between 1911 and 1926, the Church of Ireland population fell by some 85,000 in the 26 counties. Now, some of this can be accounted for by war dead and by the removal of Crown forces and their dependents. This leaves a figure of around 40,000. And I believe most of these left because of violence or the threat of violence, such as we've heard described today. Now, that's about 20% of the, let's call them the civilian population of the Church of Ireland. The figure 40,000 is perhaps not big in European terms, but a significant percentage of the total population. It has been argued elsewhere that this decline was due to voluntary or economic emigration or demographic factors by Andy Bielenberg and David Fitzpatrick. In my book, I investigate at length such statements, such arguments, and reject them as providing an explanation for the fallen numbers. Violence or the threat of violence was the main cause of their departure. During the War of Independence, many members of the Church of Ireland suffered intimidation and loss, but speeches at the synods indicate, and I find this rather curious, that the worst experience for most came afterwards, during the first half of 1922 and through the Civil War from June 1922 until the end of May 1923. The term ethnic cleansing has sometimes been used. I do not think this is appropriate to describe what happened countrywide, because it does not compare fairly with events elsewhere in this era, when ethnic and religious minorities were attacked and expelled in very large numbers, such as the Greeks in Asia Minor. At the same time, these revolutionary years, as well as the immediate aftermath, saw the exodus of substantial numbers of members of the Church of Ireland, due primarily to the widespread violence their community suffered. In these years, thousands of Belfast Catholics were also forced to leave their homes and many came south, but most seem to have returned. Between 1911 and 1926, the number of Catholics in Belfast went up, although their proportion of the population fell slightly. Figures for the decline of Southern Protestant numbers indicate that few who left returned. In spite of what happened, however, in spite of all that had gone on, the majority of the Church of Ireland community, numbering 165,000, remained in the new Irish Free State. While speakers at the synods had told of violence against members, they spoke as well of efforts to maintain good relations between denominations. Members of the government and Catholic clergy denounced such attacks on the Protestant community. A majority did not leave, in part, no doubt, because they would not give up their only means of livelihood, but also in part out of a sense of patriotism and a desire to contribute to the new state. In their professions and business, they continued to take a major role. Members of the Church of Ireland played a prominent role in both Dáil Éireann and the Senate, at least over the next decade. For most of these people, however, the approach they adopted, as Bishop Stirling had urged in 1923, was to forgive and forget. In the three-volume History of the Church of Ireland, published in 1932 to 34, there are whole chapters on the patrician period. But the author of the chapter in the modern period says very little. He chooses, as he says, not to recall the dark and terrible deeds done in Ireland. A 1953 History of the Church covered these events in one line. Now, probably in the circumstances of the times, and for the sake of those who remained, this is the best approach, just to draw a curtain over everything. Today, however, in the new circumstances of the 21st century, we can look at these matters again and investigate them fully. As we do, we can recall the words of Archbishop Darcy at the General Synod of May 1923. On that occasion, he praised the quiet courage and persistence of church members, along with their Christian fortitude and true patriotism, which he believed gave hope for the future. Thank you very much.
Brian, thank you. There is time now for a few questions. As with the speakers who will follow Brian this morning, there will also be an opportunity in the context of a panel to put questions to Brian on the upcoming years of the Decade of Centenaries. But if people have questions in relation to this talk, please feel free to pose them now.
Surely the land transfer records of 1923-24 would expose the people the landowners who had been driven out by the violence. The people most of those would have been farmers, and a lot of the violence was against the farming community. And if the people who took over the land at that stage, you know, a lot of it was done in the name of republicanism, but it was generally just land grabbing. And the other one was that the small, the administration people who left, part of the government who left in 1922, My father was brought to Scotland by his cousin, who was married to an excise man in Skibbereen, and they all had an option of going working for the new state or for going back. And this man decided to go back to Glasgow. So I would have thought, you know, the number of people who did that all around the country would have been considerable. But I'd say that farming people were the ones who, because they had the land, they were shot or they were run out.
We might take 2 or 3 questions. I know that Ian and Charles had questions as well, and perhaps we take those 3 together.
Okay, thank you, Brian, for a very careful and balanced exposition. A question, though, that I haven't been really able to ascertain. What about attacks on sectarian attacks on church buildings and church-related buildings? That surely is a sort of a measure of whether the violence was sectarian or purely sectarian. It's common in other places for churches and mosques and so on to be attacked and burnt. But I'm not clear on the extent to which that actually happened in the 26 counties during this period.
And perhaps Charles, and we'll take those 3 together then.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's very balanced. I think the difficulty, as you say, coming 100 years later, is that this can only be solved by really empirical research, you know, what happened to particular families. And I suspect there's something less than violence that could also have been in play. People moving north, which a lot of, say, in the civil service, people move north rather than stay, or you know that sort of move, and also a feeling there was an unwelcome climate. But there certainly wouldn't have been the whole Republican thing. It would have been because you were a Britisher you were got at, not because you were a Protestant. They were always proud of not being sectarian, but of course most Protestants had been Unionists, so it was a difficult one. But anyway, I'd invite you to, you know, consider, you know, lesser causes short of violence.
Thank you very much for all very interesting points. As regards the farmers, yes, farmland would have been taken over eventually, but I suppose the Register of Deeds would say that, but it wouldn't say the reason why it had happened. So it would need a knowledge of the local scene as well. As regards transfer of people, you're right to say that civil servants had an option to move to the north or move to Britain. Majority of them stayed here, of course, in the end, but some did move. And I'd have to acknowledge that. Now, as regards the question of churches that were attacked, I reckon I've come across evidence of about 5 churches that were attacked. There were 3 in County Clare in the War of Independence that I know of. There were 2 then that I know of during the Civil War. In one of them, a church was attacked, which immediately led to a response from the local Catholics who were shocked at this. So there was that degree of attack on churches, but it has to be said it wasn't very numerous. Now, the question of sectarianism is a very difficult one. If we take the Dunmanway murders, I think these can fairly be called sectarian, and that is what Erskine Childers at the time called them. Erskine Childers at that time was editor of a Public Don Éireann, a Republican journal, and he doesn't hesitate to call them sectarian. As regards the others, you're right to say that a lot of people were attacked because their politics are seen as loyalists, but the problem was that, I mean, how do you find a loyalist? And it was R.B. McDowell pointed out that Protestants were singled out for harassment because religion was the easiest way of identifying a person's politics. So there's that degree of it. And it's all very confusing. Let me give you a comparison, what happened in the north. In 1922, in the House of Lords, someone got up to condemn the expulsion of Catholics from the shipyards in Belfast. And John Lonsdale got up to respond. He was a former leader of the Ulster Unionists. He was now Lord Armadale. He said, "You're wrong. They weren't thrown out because of their religion. They're thrown out because of their politics. They're all Sinn Féiners. That's why they're thrown out." But that was a bit, I don't accept, that is arguing in a certain way that I really don't accept, because, right, they certainly weren't thrown out because people disagreed with them on transubstantiation. But when people went out to identify Sinn Féiners, how did they do that? The Catholics. And so often people who were not Sinn Féiners at all got expelled. And that was the case for loyalists who also had been attacked, and yet their politics may have been quite different. So it is a confusing area when politics and religion are so strongly intertwined.
I think there's a question there just at the back. I'll take that and then we'll come forward with this question here.
Thank you very much, Brian, for an absolutely fascinating review of the Church of Ireland records. I wonder if you can say whether or not the same sort of things obtained for those who were Methodist, Presbyterians, or Religious Society of Friends, because of course the Church of Ireland had only then recently become disestablished, and Church of Ireland persons might have been seen in a different light. Have you any research on that?
Well, thank you. There has been research done on Methodists, especially Methodists in County Cork, done by David Fitzpatrick, and he argues that between 1911 and 1921, never mind the War of Independence, Methodist numbers were dropping. He says they were dropping for ordinary demographic reasons, smaller families, the new people weren't joining the Methodists. And what he then goes on to say, because he sees Methodist numbers dropping, one can therefore apply that to the Church of Ireland. Well, I think he's quite wrong about that. I mean, these are two different communities. The Church of Ireland is a very large community, 250,000. Methodists, I think, are only about 16,000 in the whole country, and they're quite different in social composition. So I think that comparison really doesn't work. But I agree with you, the other community, I think somebody's doing work in Presbyterians at the moment, and that would be interesting as well. Thank you.
I think West Cork Methodists are still detectable. We've got with two at the front we might take together.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if you have researched any links between the burning out of Protestant landowners and the land war. I mean, if you take Ballydehob, the two landowners who were burnt out were targeted in the land war as well. They were the main opponents of the Land League in Ballydehob. And just an interesting point as well, around Ballydehob you have a lot of small Protestant farmers who were very closely integrated with the Catholic community, with their small Catholic farmer neighbours, and some of them even taking part in the playing a major role in the Land League against their landlords, their Protestant landlords.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering how much of that, I feel myself that a lot of that, especially in the Ballydehob area, that it was almost seen as a continuation in some ways of what had happened during the land war in the area. And well, I feel that a lot of what happened with the Protestant landowning class had its roots in the land war. Well,
it may have had something to do with that. I met about 2 years ago Lord Inchiquin, and it was an event in Armagh Cathedral to mark the Battle of Clontarf. And Lord Inchiquin, as you know, is a descendant of Brian Boru. And I went up to him after the service and I congratulated him. I said, I want to congratulate you on one of your ancestors. Now, I wasn't referring to William Smith O'Brien or to Brian Boru. I was referring to Lucius O'Brien, who at the time of the Great Famine, he was chairman of Board of Guardians in County Clare. And when the order came from Dublin in August 1847 to close the soup kitchens, that they were distributing food free to everybody, he refused and kept them open for another 2 months. So I said I want to congratulate him for that. He then said to me that in 1921, the IRA turned up to burn down his house, I think it's Dromoland. But the local IRA turned up and said, no, you're not doing this. And they were good landlords, refused to allow it. And then on the other hand, I was recently at Hilton Park, and the Maddens in the 1870s had been very good landlords, they'd been home rulers. The IRA turned up there as well. But the Maddens had installed iron shutters on the ground floor and iron bars, and they couldn't get in. So according to Major Madden, they then went up the road to the next house and burned it down. So it's a mixture of all these things.
I suppose, to be a little euphemistic, when elements in any society have resort to extrajudicial activities, putting it nicely, right? Yes. Which is what happened in those times. Yeah. A reign of terror prevails, literally, right? Yeah, exactly. And the Protestant community, because it was the community that had most, suffered, I think, disproportionately. But I grew up not too far from here, and I was reared by 3 aunts in their 70s who lived through that period. And my father had been a member of the old IRA. But I would listen at night in bed, because each one of us slept with one of them, right? And I could hear them talking through the night about what went on. And clearly, everybody was nervous. They didn't know who was who. It seemed to be that hoboism had taken over out there. The IRA would, or some group of men would knock on the door late at night looking for Eileen Murphy or whoever it was. And I recall very distinctly that they were trying to second guess why they were looking for Eileen Murphy or looking for William L. Kelleher. They thought that maybe Eileen Murphy had associated with a British soldier. Do you see what I'm saying? So they misled them, or they told them they didn't know where she lived, or they, even though they knew well. So there was a reign of terror, I suppose, right? And, you know, to some extent, I never heard them say that because their brother was in the old IRA, but I think their brother was in the old IRA because he could not but be in the old IRA, because everybody had to be part of the team. But I recall one thing that my father's first cousin, an older man who was also involved in rearing me, said, oftentimes I often heard him saying this: IRA, I robbed all and I ran away. A short history of Ireland in the early part of the last century.
Probably got time for one more question. I see somebody with a hand up down. Oh, well, maybe these 2 questions, and then we'll release Brian for a bit.
Thank you very much, Brian. Just a very brief, just a historical fact, actually. You said there were 90 RI seamen shot in Cork. The very last RI seaman to be killed in the Troubles in the whole of Ireland was actually shot here in Skibbereen. About 2 or 3 hours after the truce. He shouldn't have been. It was outside of it. Before the truce, yeah. He was Constable Clear was his name. So just, I think the fact that we're in Skibbereen, we note that fact.
And the gentleman at the back there with his hand up.
Thanks. I'm from Macroom, and I'm not quite sure that I qualify as a West Corkman, but I'll ask a question. I'll ask a question anyway. Have you any documentation of attacks on sports clubs? Because sport became a very divisive issue. In fact, like the origin of the GA was, as I understand it, a reaction to the Rugby and Association Football Soccer Club, who had become pre-established but had also become very much associated with the establishment. I'm talking about cricket and lawn tennis and so on and so forth. So have you any evidence of attacks? Because I suppose the Protestants that played cricket and played rugby and so on and so forth. The Catholics / nationalists played GA. Is there any evidence? Was there an overlap, like, I mean, between the IRA Republican and attacks on sports grounds, etc. and that?
I'm sorry, I can't help you. I don't know about attacks on sports grounds. I suppose people were divided like that over sports, although it was never 100%, of course, in either case. But generally speaking, I suppose that is true. But I have no evidence of sports grounds in particular being attacked.
I think we'll close this session there. I'll ask you all to thank Brian. There's an opportunity to pursue some of these themes, as I said, in the panel discussion that there will be at 1 o'clock, part of which Brian will be. And this afternoon, although actually, in fact, beginning with Una O'Halpin at 12, we'll be talking in particular about the role of the RIC, which has been mentioned several times here. And then this afternoon, Jim Herlihy and Stephen Collins will be talking about the RIC and its commemoration. So thank you, Brian, for setting a number of lines in the water.
Thank you very much.